Shadows of Brimstone, Sons of Bitches, Episode 7, The Blasted Wastes. Chapter 1, From One Hell into Another. We emerged from the Caverns of Cynder, bruised, burned, and barely alive. The air above the jagged opening was thick with black smoke and fire, and we, Bruce the Orphan, Pedro the Bandido, Marshall the Marshal, and me, Eagle the Scout, looked like men who'd fought their way out of hell. But our journey wasn't over. The only path back to Wood's End was through the blasted wastes, a cursed desert that no man crossed and lived to tell. Chapter 2, The Ghost Ambush. Twilight fell quickly, and with it came death. Ghostly Indian warriors rose from the dunes, bald and spectral, their bows unleashing bone-like arrows that passed through the air like whispers of death. Pedro cursed and threw dynamite, the explosion scattering sand and shadows alike. But the spirits reformed, angrier than before. Marshall barked orders, while Bruce fought like a cornered animal, his gun shaking in his hand. I grabbed a handful of salt and poured it into my rifle. The shot tore through one of the ghosts, making it wail and dissolve. Pedro followed suit, using salt-loaded rounds to thin their numbers until they vanished into the night. We were alive, but barely. The wastes had already drawn blood. Chapter 3, The Shifting Sands. The next morning, the dunes seemed to ripple like water under the scorching sun. We trudged forward, sweat pouring from our faces, when Pedro suddenly shouted. The ground beneath him gave way, pulling him into a sinkhole of shifting sand. Marshall and I threw him a rope and pulled with everything we had. Pedro clawed his way out, breathing hard, his hands raw and bleeding. The hole sealed itself moments later, leaving no sign it had ever existed. "This place eats men alive," Pedro muttered. None of us argued. Chapter 4, The Endless Sun. The sun was merciless, hanging in the sky like an executioner's blade. Mirage after mirage taunted us, flickering on the horizon, but worse were the whispers carried on the wind. They wormed into our heads, promising salvation, threatening despair. Pedro snapped first, shouting at voices that weren't there, his gun raised to the empty sky. "Pull it together," Marshall growled, grabbing Pedro by the shoulders. "The desert wants us mad, and I'll be damned if we give it the satisfaction." But even Marshall couldn't hide the strain. We walked in silence, each man wrestling with his own demons. Chapter 5, The Wasteland Giant. We thought we'd seen the worst of the wastes. We were wrong. The ground trembled, and a colossal figure of jagged rock and charred flesh rose from the ground. The Wasteland Giant. Its face opened into a gaping black mouth. It let out a roar that shook the sky. We scattered, firing at the creature with everything we had. Bullets ricocheted off its rocky hide as it swiped at us with hands the size of wagons. Eagle climbed an outcrop and leapt onto the giant's back, driving his knife into the cracks in its neck. Marshall fired round after round into its glowing eyes, while Bruce, barely standing, poured what was left of his strength into distracting the beast. Bruce, trembling with determination, hoisted a massive keg of dynamite over his shoulder. "Now or never!" Marshall barked as the Wasteland Giant loomed above, and with that massive barrel of explosives, the Wasteland Giant was no more. Chapter 6, A Moment's Rest. We collapsed where we stood, too drained to move. "Wood's End better be worth it," Bruce muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Marshall lit a match, his hands steady despite everything. "It will be," he said, staring into the distance. "One step at a time." And so we sat, the four of us, battered and bloodied, waiting for the courage to take the next step into the wastes. And for now, that was enough.